So a big hello and welcome to another Act Wealth Partners event. My name's Tiffany Dawson. I'm a financial advice associate from Act Wealth, and today's event is titled UK Expats Unpacked, Pensions, Myths and Smart Planning. Before we get started, a quick disclaimer. What's covered today is not personal advice. It is general in nature and should not be taken as a recommendation. And just a little bit of housekeeping. You'll see at the bottom of your screens, there is a Q&A button. So you're welcome to ask any questions throughout the webinar. And if you would like to put your name down there, that would be great. But if not, you can do that anonymously. We will try and get to as many questions as possible at the end. And also note that we will be sending around the recording afterwards. So within around 24 hours after this webinar, you'll receive that in your emails. Let's start with introducing ourselves. So before we get started, I'd love to hear a bit from Toby. So Toby and I work very closely together in the UK expat space in financial advice here at Wealth. But Toby, perhaps you could give a quick intro to your background, why you went into this role, and what you do day to day at Wealth.
Thanks, Tiff. Yeah, I've been I suppose, in this environment, in the financial planning environment for the last 10 years, focusing very much on the expat. Being an expat myself, I started a business and that business has now become part of APT, and it's focused very much on some of the things that I needed back in the day when I realized that living with assets cross-border was not necessarily helpful to me for a long term in terms of planning. I've lived actually in a number of countries over my journey. I started off in South Africa, and then I went into the Middle East, and I went to Singapore and Malaysia and ended up in Australia. And we've decided to settle here for the long term with a view to staying here forever, I suppose. And our three children have been growing up here and hopefully we'll stay here, but needs must. This world is getting smaller, and there's a massive need clearly for people to focus on cross-border finances, because it's a world where people are living in different places throughout their lives. So that was certainly my journey, and it's close to my heart. I love helping people that are in a similar situation to me, and with my background in investment and pensions and providing advice, I felt this was perfect for me. And certainly in Australia, we've got a lot of Brits here, and we've got a lot of people moving here. So it's a busy time, but very rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing to say is that there's actually very few people who are as experienced as Toby in this UK expat space in the whole country. There aren't very many people who provide UK expat advice in Australia, and you've definitely been doing it longer than most. So yeah, we're very lucky to be having this conversation with you today and sharing all your knowledge.
Thank you, Tiff. Yeah, I found that when I was looking for advice or thinking about what was there to help me, there was very little. So it's an area that people don't necessarily get into, and I found that therefore there's little opportunity to go out and find advisors all over the country. I deal with people that, from an Australian perspective, in all the different states, and travel to see them and work with them. So I do also get to see the country a lot, which is great.
Wonderful. And then a quick intro from me. So I'm Tiffany. I have also been on the UK expat journey myself personally. So I moved, I'm from Australia originally. I moved to the UK and lived there for about 6.5 years, where I qualified as a financial advisor over there and worked there for a short period of time. Then decided to move back to Australia to be closer to my family and with a young family of my own, it just made sense to be back here. So, in amongst all of the trials and tribulations of moving countries, there's also, the change of job, making sure your family is settled, but also the finance piece was so important to me as well. And I know that finances can sometimes be left behind because it doesn't seem like the most urgent thing to deal with at the time. But really, I found that the finance piece touches every aspect of my life. So when we speak to clients who are making the move, I very much feel for them and can relate and know how much value it can be for them to have their finance sorted out and just not having that to worry about. So today's going to be very much an open discussion, and I think I wanted to talk about why this webinar came about in the first place. So just to give you some context, I probably speak to about 20 people wanting UK expat financial advice a month. How many do you think you'd speak to each month, Toby?
Yeah, probably that is a minimum. I would say there's a lot of people that inquire that actually really want to speak to us. So, trying to fit it all in is quite difficult, but probably around 20.
Yeah, so between us, we speak to as many people as possible and try and provide that help initially, and sometimes they become clients. But we found that through those conversations, there are a lot of repetitive themes. There are a lot of things that people worry about that are the same from case to case, no matter whether they're moving by themselves, they're a bit older, or they're younger, they're moving with family. It's similar concerns. And also there are things that we wish that we could tell everyone from the outset. So really today's webinar is going to try and answer some of those really common questions and to discuss some of those challenges and pitfalls that we see with our clients as well. So I think just to give this conversation some context, it would be really good, Toby, if you could help us to think about what are the main differences between UK finances and Australian finance. I think the best place to start is probably UK pensions versus Australian superannuation. What are the main differences between the two?
Okay, so I would start with saying that superannuation in the main taxes you a little bit when you're accumulating and is free of tax when you are drawing down. Whereas in the UK, it's generally tax-free while you're accumulating, and the UK taxes you when you're drawing down at marginal tax rates. So that's almost a 180. It's very different. I suppose if you had an ideal timeline, you would accumulate in the UK tax-free and deaccumulate in Australia, move to Australia at the point you retire. But nobody ever manages to do that. But they are very different like that. So from a tax context, that's obvious. I think with superannuation, a little bit like the UK, there are limits of how much you can have in superannuation. So the government is obviously concessionally taxing superannuation and giving you great benefits for saving your money in superannuation. But the ATO, the Australian Tax Office, don't want to allow you to have all your money there because they want some tax from some of your money. I think the UK, allows you to accumulate your money, but it's not necessarily the place to put your tax-free money, and therefore they offer other products like the ISA, and the ISA in the UK is a very tax-effective way of saving money, and we don't have anything like that in Australia because superannuation is seen as the nirvana environment to put your money from a tax saving perspective and a saving perspective, and they incentivize in both countries for you to save. And here in Australia, they're a mandated 12% at the moment to put into super from the companies. So there's a big focus on driving retirement savings here for people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that probably shifts the mindset of Australians who've been here for a long time in terms of their savings. There's very few incentives to save money that's accessible before you reach retirement age in Australia versus in the UK, as you mentioned, Toby. There is the ISA, the individual savings account, where you are you have £20,000 tax free a year. Although I hear there might be some changes with that coming up. So rules are always changing, and I think that's something that we pride ourselves in keeping on top of every day, because we are talking to people at different stages of their UK move here all the time. Okay, so that gives us some background and context as to the conversation we're about to have today. And I guess when we're talking to new clients, people come to us at different times. So I guess one question for you, Toby, is why are people coming to you for help in the first place? So from your experience, what exactly is prompting a client to start a conversation with you?
Yeah, you could probably put people into three different buckets, I suppose. The most common questions are normally prompted as a result of sort of nearing retirement and thinking about retirement, and only then really sort of thinking that they've got money in a different country, in a different environment, and how do they get their hands on it, and what's the tax consequence of having this money in another country. And generally those people are already in Australia, but we often get a lot of people that are moving here to retire, and so that's at the forefront of their mind. So whether they're moving here to retire or they are actually the minority of people that are thinking about it in the way that perhaps you did, Tiffany, when you moved here, a little while ago. They're coming to us because they know that they're moving and that they have a long-term plan to stay in Australia, and ultimately they've got these pots of money in the UK that they know perhaps need to be looked at in the context of becoming an Australian tax resident. And so generally that drives them. And then there are the people in between who have been here and are talking to people along the journey of being here, and they perhaps know they should do something, but life is busy. They're in the midst of looking after families and jobs and living their lives, that actually a retirement is a little bit far away, and they're not really thinking about that. But they perhaps eventually come and talk to us, and sometimes those people are 10 years from retirement, but they're thinking, right, I'm now perhaps late 40s, early 50s, I need to really tackle this and get on with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like, you've talked about two types of people. Some are the ones who are really proactive before they come to Australia. They're trying to get all their ducks in a row before they move. And then there's a second type of person who may not have prioritized it at the start, but, the next best time to look at it is, today, I guess. So they're doing that. They are reaching out for the help when they need it. Then there's a third type of person who is completely ignoring it and burying their heads in the sand because it's all too overwhelming and difficult. So luckily, if you're someone who's watching this webinar today, you're not part of that third group of people, because you are trying to find out that information for yourself. So that's a really great first step.
I will say,
Go on.
sorry to interrupt you. I will say that the greater majority of people are actually the people that haven't really given it a huge amount of thought until they really need to give it a huge amount of thought. So it's very normal for people to live their lives and then it all suddenly crops up, and that's not the end of the world. That's not a problem. It's just, there's some consequences for that.
Yeah, 100%. Let's start with that first group of people. I know that a lot of people who signed up to watch this webinar are still in the UK. So let's talk to those people first. For someone who is still in the UK, as a financial advisor in this space, what do you think they should be thinking about before they make the move?
Okay, so probably the most important thing is to think about what you've got, to at least have a reasonably good understanding of what's what. Do you have ISAs? Do you have pensions? How many of each? Do you have some connectivity to those financial institutions? Is it a pension that you had from a job 7, 8, 10 years ago that you haven't looked at, but it's there? Get in touch with those companies, tell them what you're thinking of doing, understand a little bit about what you've got, and perhaps get some documentation that would allow someone like me to look at it and go, okay, I can see what you've got here. I can see a statement. I understand the type of pension it is, etc. If you've managed to do that, or what you've got, and you're pretty organized, and you feel that you could consolidate your pensions if you or your pots of money into less pots, I suppose. So a lot of people, like in Australia, a lot of Australians will move jobs and they'll have different retirement pots, pension pots, superannuation pots. Try and maybe think about consolidating them into one, and then arriving in Australia with one. It makes it a lot easier to manage. And of course, if you have thought about this with time, so 6 to 9 months before you depart the UK, or you're going to depart the UK, perhaps get in contact with someone like me, or with a company like Apt, because we can really guide you in the bare minimum that you can do. And we appreciate that there's lots of other priorities going on, like finding schools and packing up a house or selling a house or whatever it happens to be. But it would be very helpful and probably save money and time to have that conversation early doors, and just understand perhaps what would be necessary. So you just need to lift the lid a bit and understand a little bit about what you've got, and hopefully have a conversation with someone.
Yeah. So I think if I could distill that down into two things that people could take away is make sure you've got some sort of communication channel with the financial institution. So that might be a UK pension provider, your banks. If you can have those communication lines, have your member number, know how to log on to the portal. That saves so much time when you get to Australia and we're trying to sort out your UK finances from the other side of the world. And yeah, the other is just knowing what you've got and potentially simplifying the structure of things before you move.
Yeah.
Okay, so you talked about before that there might be some people who've actually been in the country already. So they've already left the UK, they've landed in Australia, they might have been here for 6 months, a year, some cases up to 20 years before they reach out to us. You said that that's not a problem, but there are some consequences to that. Can you talk to that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I suppose the idea of thinking about what to do with assets that still sit in the UK as an Australian resident is generally looking through the tax lens. And what does it mean for me? Can I access it? I've heard this, I've read this, I've looked online, I've used, various mechanisms to see that the consequences of accessing this money could be somewhat penal, I suppose. I would say that generally the ATO, the equivalent of HMRC, the ATO, are going to tax a pension that potentially arrives in this country, if it is transferred to this country, on the earnings since the person became a tax resident. So, all they're trying to do is that they're trying to get the tax that they would have got had you moved the pension right at the beginning, having arrived in the country. And so they're just, commuting that tax that they should have had into one upfront payment when you bring it over. So that's fine. That doesn't therefore mean you've paid any more tax. It just means that it's perhaps a higher number to swallow at the beginning, rather than it happening over a long period of time. But bringing it over, or assessing it and leaving it there if it's necessary to leave in the UK, is something that's very possible, and we do all the time. And it's not a foregone conclusion to say, well, all of your assets in the UK should come to Australia, and there are tax consequences if you don't. That's not really necessarily true. And like the UK, Australia has zero tax rates, nil tax bands, and levels, and the tax can be offset against other mechanisms. So the conversation can be actually very enlightening and quite liberating for people that have been here for a long period of time, because suddenly this myth of oh, there's going to be a lot of tax, and oh, I wish I'd done it earlier, actually dissipates, because the reality of it is not quite so stark. It can be managed effectively. I think that's probably, just generally the main thing that pops into people's heads, that precipitates concern and nervousness and gives anxiety and that sort of thing. So those conversations, whether they're 20 years or within 6 months, are fine. And as I said earlier, generally most people are in that bucket.
Yeah. And, when we're speaking to these people every day, what I hear again and again is that this has been playing on someone's mind for years, if not decades, and they've just ignored it or just pushed it to one side because they were so afraid to touch it and ruin something or break the system somehow and make a really costly mistake. So I think that the moment that they have that conversation with us, that removes so much of that fear and anxiety already. So we just always wish that people would reach out earlier before they get to that point. So really, start a conversation with someone who does this kind of work and see where that goes. They might not be able to help you straight away, but at least they can point you in the right direction.
Yeah.
Okay, the next thing that is a real consideration for us when we are working with UK expat clients is age. So there is a real consideration of, we will treat someone's financial advice case differently if they are under 55 or over 55. Toby, could you talk to that a little bit?
Yes. Well, the third thing to say is that the UK rules have changed as of April 2028, when it becomes 57. So in other words, at the age of 57, that's the earliest point in time that you can access your pension, your UK pension. And again, that mirrors to when you can transfer it out of a pension to potentially an Australian superannuation. So we get a lot of people that have moved here in their late 30s, early 40s. Tiff, you're a very good example of that, right? So you're in your early 30s, maybe. And you've got pensions and you're wondering what to do with them. Do I leave them there, or is there something I can do with them? Well, we manage and look after a lot of UK pension capital for people who are under the age, currently 55, soon to be 57, that can't move their money here. And we actually look after a lot of pension capital for people that are in retirement that remains in the UK, because it's sensible to do that. And so that money, okay, it under 55 stroke 57 needs to stay in the UK, but it needs to be transparent. It needs to be flexible. People need to understand what it is and see, what they can get out of that money. These are sometimes very, very important pots and very significant numbers that are going to support retirement. And so it needs to be treated in exactly the same way as superannuation may be treated, or any investment, right? So that's fine. So we'd look after that, and potentially it would move across at the age of 55, 57. For everybody that has that option, the consideration at that point in time, that age, is to see whether it's sensible to move it over to Australia, and whether there are better outcomes for it to sit here in Australia than in the UK. And we do comparisons and we look at all the variables. And one of the most important things when we're providing advice to implement something like that is what was the alternative, and why did we discount the alternative? It's not just about the grass is greener on the other side. It's very much a full-on evaluation around what's right for you in your particular circumstances. That age is obviously, I can now have it in Australia, and I can combine it potentially with my superannuation that I've got here already, or I can move here knowing that I'm retiring in Australia, and I can move my pension to Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that kind of gives people an idea of what they can and can't do at the age of 55 at the moment, 57 in 2028. And when I have been looking on forums and Facebook groups about moving UK pensions, a lot of what's talked about is that you can't do anything until you're 55, so just ignore it until then. I know what you would say about that, Toby, but that seems to be the common thing that's talked about, but that's not necessarily the case. As you said, there are ways to structure it so that it is supporting your financial plan in Australia when you plan to retire here. And it's not necessarily true that you can't do anything at all with your pensions until you reach that age.
Totally, totally. It would be sad if people read something and then did nothing and then realized that they could have done something. So I suppose the moral of the story is to reach out to people that know what they're talking about, rather than listening to and reading the unedited versions of people's views online, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Okay, I'm going to ask you the $1 million question now, Toby, which is the question we get asked every day. Should
Mhm.
I move my UK pension from the UK to Australia? So the question for you really is, as a financial advisor, what are the types of things you are considering in order to answer that question for someone?
Okay, so I mean, obviously everyone's different, but if you were moving it before you were retiring, and you wanted to move it, often people come with this objective: I want to have all my money here, and that's sometimes something very important to sort of try and implement on that basis. I suppose the reason why you would move it here rather than keep it there is probably because the quantum of money, if you start drawing it down from the UK, is going to create significant tax. So Australia will tax the majority or part of that pension as it's drawn down, as if it's income. Whereas if it's moved to Australia and it's in the system, and yes, there might be some upfront taxes, but actually single digit generally on the total amount that's moved, that when it's in the system here and you're in retirement, you're drawing down from it tax-free, your earnings are tax-free. It's a much more effective environment to have retirement capital. And so that's probably the main reason why I would be advising people to move it. But if there was a smaller amount of money and people were drawing down money over a longer period of time from the UK, and perhaps their taxable income in retirement was going to be low, then actually, apart from exchange rates and the clunkiness of having money over there and not here, the tax impost is negligible, and so that's not a
Mhm.
reason to think about moving it. There's obviously other areas that we consider. People that are moving here, people that have moved here. There's this whole inheritance tax piece and the net, and how it's now capturing UK pensions as of very recently, and in the future as it comes into law. That aspect of it needs serious consideration. It's a huge topic, and so we probably have to talk about that separately. But
Yeah.
the point is, that's one of our lenses that we look through when we're looking at someone's situation, and by moving it out of the UK and potentially over time, you shake that liability to the inheritance tax net. And so that's a good reason to think about moving it. I suppose the idea of having control of something in your time zone and being able to invest it in Australian dollars in line with your superannuation, one pot, one stop shop, making it easier to see, those sort of aspects are not necessarily big reasons to move it, but they all are added bonuses.
Yeah, I think what you've touched on there is really interesting because a lot of people think if I'm coming to a financial advisor, I'm coming to them for the number crunching, which is obviously a lot of what we do. We compare the two or maybe three options that you might have for your UK pension and crunch the numbers, make sure you understand if you left it there, this would be the tax implication versus if you moved it here, this is the amount of tax. And then you can make that comparison black and white on paper. So that is a very big part of what we do. But I think what people don't understand so much about what we do is we get to know our clients and understand what are they comfortable with. Do they really want that level of control and simplicity? And if so, maybe that is a really big part of the things that you would recommend for them versus someone else who might feel very comfortable managing lots of different pots of money. And if that is the best tax consequence for them, then perhaps that's the best for them. So it's really tailoring the structure of your finances to that specific person and their needs.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the important thing is that either way, they can have control and they can see what's going on. And assuming they are engaging and taking on the services of a financial advice firm such as Apps, they can avail themselves of all of the good things that come out of those conversations that they're having throughout the year on an ongoing basis. And things morph. And the most important thing is that people can be flexible. And if they don't want to make the decision today, or they want to make one that may change tomorrow, that's fine. We just need to know that, and we can provide a pathway that essentially enables people to meet those objectives.
Definitely. Now, moving on from that topic, I know that there's probably going to be some people who are listening to this webinar who perhaps don't want to engage a financial advisor and want to do this themselves. And we talked about this yesterday, Toby, didn't we? You know, it is very possible to do this yourself. Obviously, you need to keep on top of all the ever-changing rules in the UK system and the Australian system. And if that's your bag and that's the type of thing that you like to do, people do that when they move over. But if someone is doing that, what is, say, the biggest pitfall that you wish they knew about before they started on that journey?
Yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? Sometimes you don't know actually what the consequence is going to be if you never knew the rule or the law, or you didn't delve under the bonnet deep enough. And because everything is about election and self-declaration, you know, HMRC and ATO, sometimes you never know that you've made a mistake. One of the common mistakes is that you can partially transfer a pension, and you can have it arrive into a super fund, a qualifying super fund here, and have the taxes paid at superannuation rates. So that's very, very concessional. That's at 15%, as opposed to marginal tax rates, which could be up to 47%. But by transferring a partial amount, you are not allowed to elect to have the super fund pay the tax. And you really need to move the whole lot. And if you move the whole lot, then what are the consequences of moving the whole lot? Because you might be in excess of contributions allowances that you can bring into superannuation. Can you have an excess contribution? And what are the consequences of that? And so sometimes people transfer pensions, and then suddenly they get told, well, the reality of transferring that pension means that this is the case, this is the outcome. And it hadn't been considered, and now it's done. It can't be rescinded. And sometimes people, you know, will transfer pensions that perhaps shouldn't be transferred, because they haven't necessarily reviewed every single bit of the future around what Australia is going to deliver for them over the next 10 or 15 years, and then find themselves in a situation where it's really quite costly to have both or to have moved it. So I suppose I'm not really pinpointing necessarily one huge alarm bell, other than to say there are probably 5 rules that you need to adhere to that, you know, depending on your circumstances, that can create a very costly outcome if you don't adhere to them. And look, you can see them, read them, you can, you know, the ATO is tremendous in providing information, you know, on its website as to what you need to think about when you do things like this, when you do move pensions. You know, so you can do it yourself. I suppose it's a bit like, you know, you want to be able to diagnose the full extent of what is necessary to be able to provide the full extent of the solution. And if you haven't actually covered all your bases, sometimes doing things without the knowledge of an aspect that could come back to bite you would be dangerous.
And then on the flip side, perhaps not acting when you could have acted, could have could cost you as well. It might have been in your best interest to actually do something, but you thought that you couldn't. I know, we're using AI more and more these days for all aspects of our lives, and we know working in this field that a lot of people are turning to AI to help them with their finances. I personally think it's brilliant that people are trying to educate themselves and find out information so they can take control of their financial future. I think that's really great. Um, but AI doesn't always get it right. And especially when it comes to these cross-border rules at the moment, it can be difficult to get accurate answers out of AI. And we always recommend people to speak to someone who's been doing this for a long time. And our clients benefit from the fact that we do this every day, and any mistakes, if they're ever made, they're insured by us being fully regulated. It's on us rather than if you follow AI, who's taking responsibility there. So there's a level of comfort and that peace of mind as well, that comes to at least finding out the answers from someone who is fully qualified and regulated in the area.
Yeah, I'll just say I have plenty of conversations with people that come and talk to me that sort of feel, okay, well, that all sounds really good. I don't think I need to do it now. If I didn't do it now, what are the consequences? And I just make that very clear. And sometimes the consequences are really minimal, if at all, any consequence of delaying it. It's just important, I suppose, to know where you stand at a particular time. It's not about trying to get you to become a client of a financial advisor and to change your whole situation. It's probably much more about making sure that you're informed, and we're all about, what goes around comes around, and we want to try and pay it forward a bit and help you to help others that you're talking about, because there's so many people that have come a cropper and that have actually, fallen foul of particular situations with the best endeavors in mind and trying to help themselves. And some of us on this webinar may have had experiences with the ATO or with HMRC. It's fairly black and white, and they don't really have any empathy or sympathy for anyone's cause. So, you want to try and avoid that.
And HMRC is exactly the same. You've got two different institutions not giving you any sympathy whatsoever. So, yeah, absolutely. If I can highlight one big pitfall that does catch people out, it is the pension commencement lump sum in the UK. So if you're in the UK and you retire there, you can take 25% of the value of your UK pension tax-free. A lot of people don't know that if you are residing in Australia and you take that 25% commencement lump sum, or the PCLS, that it's actually not tax-free because you're taxed as if it's income in Australia. I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, Toby.
Well, only to say that, when you are offered a large lump of money and you're an Australian tax resident, at the point of the retirement, so let's say you're 60 and your pension in the UK says, and you can have 25% of this tax-free, and you look at it as a big lump sum, and maybe that'll help me pay off my mortgage and set me up for retirement, or I can go on the wonderful holiday that I want to now that I've started retirement. It's really important to know that sometimes those sums are so significant that half of it can be taken in tax from an Australian perspective. So that's pretty important to know. The other thing to say with this 25% or this pension commencement lump sum, or this amount of money that you can get out of a pension, from a UK perspective at the point in time that it becomes available to you, 55, 57, etc. If you're moving to Australia at that point in time and you are able to access 25% of it, and it's tax-free in the UK, it would be sensible to access that before you move to Australia, where it becomes taxable. So, those are some of the things that we talk about when we have those conversations with people who have let us know that they're planning to move here and they are of age to access that money. It's definitely something we think about in the bigger scheme of things in the strategy moving forward.
Yeah, really good point there. Really good point. Okay, so I guess that's like one example of a mistake that some people do make, and there are countless pitfalls. But as Toby said, if it's in your inclination to read up on all of that, the rules are there, and all the information is available. Yeah, just be careful before you make a big move.
Yeah.
Okay, so what if someone has gone through that whole process of moving over their finances from the UK? They've settled here in Australia, all their money is now in Australia, and they've done the big move. What happens after that? So all their money's here, they've financially settled. Um, if everything's now Australianized, what would you be thinking about for them, for those clients who've been with you for a long time?
Yeah, so there's definitely some emphasis on, you've only really covered the tip of the iceberg. There's so much underwater. And the future is very important because you've now made these decisions and it's arrived, and you need to look after it, nurture it, and do all the right things with it. I suppose, those decisions are around, should I have financial advice on an ongoing basis or not? Generally, we work with people that have the inclination to want to outsource the management of their wealth, and to ensure that they're doing things in the right way, in the most systematic way, in the most sensible way, for everything that's going to mean that they can live their best lives in retirement and in their futures. That we are there, to be in their corner and to support them all the way along the journey. But there's some, vagaries that exist. So if you've been able to bring over a pension into a scheme here, it has to have the approvals of HMRC in the UK. So it has to be a qualifying scheme, and you have to report back to HMRC. So, those are things that require, thought, and it's terribly important to make sure that you discharge that responsibility. Often that is outsourced to a financial advice firm like apps and to us. That's one example of needing to manage it, understanding the best way to identify which dollar or pound should be in which pot, and at what point it can go into each pot, and all of the rules around contributions and limits and maximum superannuation balances. And then if you're fortunate enough to have those sorts of balances, what do we do with money that can't go into super? Those are all questions that will get answered along the journey. And knowing, I suppose, that there's a service that provides that, and it's very robust, and we do it for 2,500 families. We're good at it, and we know how to help people and make sure that we're not missing things, and that people are covering all bases. So that's probably ultimately where it goes, right? Obviously everyone's different, but there's the ideas that people have, and the objectives that people have, and we ultimately try to make sure that we can help them achieve those objectives.
Yeah, definitely. I want to make sure we leave time for questions because I can see there's a couple here already. If you haven't put in your question, now's a good time to do it. But I guess before we close off, it would be really nice to illustrate some of the examples of clients that we've had come through and how we've helped them. There's one that comes to mind specifically for me, and this client couple is very new to us. They have just started their journey with us, but so they have actually lived in Australia for, I think it was 15 to 20 years. They're coming up to retirement, and they've realized that, oh, actually, I do have some UK pension. I should probably think about that. So this is really common for us. We get lots of people who've been here for decades and only start thinking about it when it comes time. This client couple has never owned their own home, and they had this pipe dream that they never thought was possible, to go and live in this town in Queensland that they've been on holiday to. They really loved it. They've been there a couple of times, and they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could go and retire there one day? So they never thought that that was possible. But they came to us, and we had a look at everything that they had. And they actually weren't going to mention this goal of theirs, but we really dug deeper and just to try and find out what mattered to them. And when we looked into it, we actually uncovered that if we were to structure things in a sensible way, that they could actually not only own their own home, but go and retire in that coastal town. So this is going to be this 4-year journey that we're helping them go on. And it's really exciting. And it's definitely something that gets me up in the morning to come to work and do this sort of thing, to help our clients to actually structure their finances in a way that's not just, no longer giving them anxiety, but actually opening up so many doors for them in the future. So that's just one example out of many of these clients where we've helped them along the journey.
Yeah, it's nice one, that one, Tiff. It's lovely to know that you can actually help them realize that they've got more money than they think they have, and that there's some obvious plans that can allow them to achieve their goals. And it's interesting how people, who are extremely good at what they do in their own profession, really can't get to grips with the reality of what's potentially there for them to think about in their finances. So it's really rewarding and lovely for you, especially to have that relationship with them. They must think you're wonderful.
I hope so. And how about you, Toby? I know there is a family that you speak about often as well, and it really brings a smile to your face when you're talking about them.
Well, they spend their often their times just continually thanking me for, and I don't believe it's just about what I've done, but ultimately they've made some decisions, big decisions, and they had, he had been made redundant around the age of 53. She was a teacher, a little bit older than him. He had 2 big defined benefit pensions that he didn't know what to do with, and he was terribly concerned about his longevity and whether those pensions would afford his wife an income in the event of a catastrophe. Ultimately, they had a big mortgage. He didn't have a job. They were just very, very concerned about the future. And they had 2 teenage children that they had aspirations for. All of them wanted to see some success in certain areas. So ultimately, they extracted money from the defined benefit pensions, and they were offered very good valuations for those. And they consolidated those into a pension in the UK without the guarantee. Okay, they gave up the guarantee. But then they were able to move the money over time into Australia, and ultimately they were able to access some of that money through one of the mechanisms that we suggested, and they were able to pay off the mortgage. And that was a huge burden and removed all of that anxiety. Actually, I've seen how different they have become since that mortgage has gone. Amazing how debt stresses people out, and understandably so. But importantly, they've been able to send one of their children to a university in America, and he's doing particularly well. And there's this plan for him to do various things in America, and that was his aspiration. And so it's a huge box to be ticked for them that they've been able to afford it. And we've done all these projections and given them some foresight in modeling so that they can use some level of assumption to see where they're going to get to and how long their money's going to last. And whilst they probably were going to be able to afford a lot of what they needed to do by carrying on the way they weren't going to have to pay. They weren't able to pay off their mortgage. They wouldn't have been able to pay off their mortgage so early. So that's done, and that's reduced a huge amount of cost, and they've been able to then fund this different type of tertiary education. They're very comfortable. They've worked very hard for what they've managed to put together, and so they're not short of money, but they've now got access and flexibility and control, and they can see the light, so to speak, and feel much more relaxed. I think that's probably the thing that gives them so much comfort in having this relationship with us.
That's so wonderful. Yeah, I love stories like that. And I know, you've got so many of those stories. And if you ask any of the advisors at Apt, they've all got these types of stories. So it's a really wonderful place to work. But yeah, I guess I hope, before we get to questions, I hope that gives you a really good overview. And it's really just hitting the tip of the iceberg here today. But at least you kind of get an idea of how we're thinking about cases such as yours, if you are a UK expat moving to Australia, the types of considerations that we make, and hopefully that helps you to make some good choices for yourself as well. So let's start with some questions. We've got a few here. So we've got a question from Joanna. Does the advice change if you're unsure if you'll be in Australia for 3 to 4 years or indefinitely? What would you say to that, Toby?
So probably yes. There's an aspect of it being modelled on the basis that your pathway may lead you back to the UK. I mean, some of that depends on your age. You can leave things as they are if you know you're going back to the UK in 3 or 4 years. But I think there's some value in checking and sense testing that. The one issue with superannuation for people that aren't living here for a long period of time is that the ATO tax people that want to move their money out of superannuation, and the tax is astronomical, actually. So they call it a departing Australian super payment, and so if you've been in Australia for 3 or 4 years, and you're going to go back and you've saved money in superannuation and you're never going to be in Australia again, then you'll be taxed heavily on that amount of money that you take out of superannuation if that's what you choose to do. But I think the point is we would prefer to talk to you at the beginning of that journey so that you knew what the consequences were and what your options were, and that if your decision was, whilst unsure at that time or this time, changing to end up staying here on a more indefinite basis, then you can start the process, at that stage, I suppose, is what I would say.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the considerations are probably different. And I guess also we have had clients who intended to live in Australia indefinitely but have had to move back. And that is something that we deal with when it happens. We never have a crystal ball as to what's going to happen. You can never say this is definitely it forever. So sometimes the plan has to be flexible, and we try and deal with it as it comes.
Yeah.
Okay, second question from Tony. Thanks for your question. Would the lump sum, and I think this is talking about the pension commencement lump sum, would the lump sum be taxed if it stayed in the UK but was drawn down periodically from a UK account?
So the taxable event is the withdrawal from the pension. And if that's what we're saying, it had been withdrawn but then got left in a UK bank account and got drawn across to Australia on a more piecemeal basis. The taxable event is at the point in time that it comes out of the pension to go into the bank account, if that's what Tony means. Yeah, so that's, we don't want people to necessarily take the lump sum unless there's other mitigating circumstances to support tax efficiency.
Yeah, absolutely. And then a third question. By the way, if you still have questions, we do have time for another one after this one. So if you haven't put your question in or want us to talk about a topic, please do put it into the question box. But the final question I have so far here is, how would funds left in ISAs be treated by the ATO if withdrawn after moving to Australia?
So the ISA, whilst tax effective as a resident of the UK, is not tax effective in the same way in Australia. You can liken it, I suppose, to, rather than having an ISA, having just an investment portfolio in the UK. That investment portfolio would be at the behest of capital gains tax. In Australia, if you have a pot of money that's not in superannuation or not in UK pension, it is considered an asset like a share or a property, or any asset that you own, where it grows and you dispose of that asset. That is a taxable event, and generally the gain on that is taxed at marginal rates.
And I'm going to ask a question of you, Toby, which is something that might be on the attendees' minds, but they're too polite to ask, which is, What happens if you don't know the answer to something? Because we said before that there are very few people in Australia who do this sort of UK expat work. What if I come with a case and you don't know how to deal with something specifically?
Yeah, so that happens a lot, because there's some complexities in it. And well, look, I know I suppose I'm a bit more of a generalist. I'm not the brain surgeon here. So if I need to get some real I need to delve deep and get some complexity understood, I would always go to one of our trusted partners. We've got tax lawyers, we've got very, very good cross-border accountants. And together we sort of brainstorm a situation, and then there are other people that have done a lot of this, and in this fraternity, I suppose you could say, we're all trying to help each other do the best for the environment we work in. And so we always talk about strategies that have come up on our tables that we want to try and think about and test. Ultimately, there's enough people and enough very, very solid brains, much better than mine, that could actually give another layer of prudency to a decision that's going to be made. I mean, look, in general, I would say I would be able to help people in the main, and we've done so much of this work that I've certainly learned along the journey what I need to really think about, and perhaps if I'm providing some advice, what I'm prepared to provide advice on. But yeah, whilst there's a smaller amount of financial advisors, there's a lot of people that will provide cross-border support around tax and decision making, that you need to make in context of HMRC and ATO.
Mhm. Yeah, and a lot of the time, we get inquiries from people who actually require tax advice rather than financial advice, and we're always happy to point them in the right direction. I think it's always worth just asking the question, because this is your future. This is your financial future that you want to build. Maybe not just for yourself, it might be for your family, for your partner, anyone that you might want to leave some wealth to. So, yeah, it's really important that you get educated and seek the support that you need when you need it. So that concludes our webinar for today. We hope that's been really helpful. Are there any final words that you want to share, Toby?
I suppose the only thing to say would be, we want to do a series of webinars, and the content of the webinar is really important. It needs to be relevant. If anyone's got any feedback, please let us know. If anybody's got any topics, please let us know. But thank you from my side for listening, and I hope what I've said makes a little bit of sense, or more than a little bit of sense. And of course, we're here to assist you at any stage of your future journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for listening from me as well. You will receive the recording to this. So if you have listened in today, but you know of someone in a similar situation that might benefit from this webinar, you can feel free to forward that over to them as well. We are here to answer questions. You have our details on the screen there. So yeah, we hope that we cross paths with you, or that this webinar has been helpful to you, and all the best of luck. Thank you very much, and goodbye.